Alexander Gray was the kind of man whose name alone commanded attention. In the corporate world, he was regarded as a genius, ruthless in business, precise in judgment, and almost untouchable in his financial empire. His face frequently appeared on the covers of Forbes and business magazines, his investments spanning from technology to real estate. People envied him, admired him, even feared him. But behind the polished image of a billionaire lay a man whose personal life was far from enviable. The Gray mansion sat on the outskirts of the city, an architectural marvel with high glass walls and sprawling gardens manicured to perfection. It was guarded by stone lions at its gates, symbols of wealth and power. To outsiders, the mansion seemed like a palace of happiness. But within those walls lay silence. Heavy, suffocating silence. Alexander had lost his wife, Clara, 5 years earlier. She had been the light of his life, the only one who softened the sharp edges of his personality. Clara had been gentle, artistic, and deeply nurturing, the kind of woman who balanced Alexander's cold practicality with warmth. Her death from a sudden illness left a void in the household that no amount of money could fill. The greatest victim of that loss wasn't Alexander. It was their son, Ethan. Ethan was only 3 years old when Clara passed, too young to fully comprehend death, yet old enough to feel the absence of his mother's touch. He grew up in a world where love had been replaced by routine and formality. Alexander, drowning in grief and throwing himself into work as a distraction, left Ethan largely in the care of nannies and housekeepers. Despite his wealth, Alexander struggled with fatherhood. To him, providing meant ensuring his son had the best of everything: schools, toys, clothes, even a personal tutor. But fatherhood wasn't only about providing. It was about presence, listening, and patience. These were things Alexander, with his never-ending boardroom battles and international meetings, never seemed to offer. The mansion reflected his life. Immaculate, cold, and meticulously organized. Every room gleamed with expensive furniture but lacked warmth. Ethan's toys sat in his playroom, untouched, because no one was there to sit on the carpet with him and make castles out of blocks. His meals were served on silver trays by maids who followed strict schedules. But nobody sat at the table to laugh or talk with him. In many ways, Alexander told himself he was doing what was best. He believed his duty was to secure Ethan's future by building a financial empire so vast that his son would never know struggle. But what he failed to see was that Ethan was struggling every day. Not for comfort, but for connection. It was at this time that Maria entered their lives. Maria was hired as a maid, one among many in the household staff. She was a black woman in her early 30s, with a quiet strength and a nurturing heart that shone through in every task she performed. Though her role was not directly tied to Ethan's care, she often found herself crossing paths with the boy, picking up his toys left scattered in the hallway, folding his little clothes, or passing by his room where he often sat quietly, lost in thought. Unlike the other staff, who saw Ethan merely as the boss's child, Maria saw something deeper. She saw a boy starved of affection, his eyes searching for something, or someone, to fill the emptiness. And though it wasn't in her job description, her heart ached for him. She began offering small gestures. A smile here, a kind word there, or slipping him a cookie when no one was looking. At first, Alexander barely noticed Maria. To him, staff members came and went. They were there to maintain order, not to build bonds. But slowly, Maria's presence began to shift the atmosphere in the mansion. While the grand halls still echoed with silence, there was now a subtle warmth in the corners where Ethan and Maria shared moments. A laughter in the garden, a whispered story at bedtime when the nannies had clocked out. Alexander, however, remained blind to this change. He was consumed with his empire, attending galas, hosting investors, and negotiating multi-million-dollar deals. He often returned home late at night, greeted only by the sight of his son already asleep and the quiet hum of the staff closing the mansion for the night. To him, everything seemed fine. He reassured himself that Ethan had everything he needed: food, shelter, and education. But what Alexander failed to grasp was that Ethan didn't need riches. He needed love. The contrast between Alexander's world and Ethan's needs grew starker with each passing day. On weekends, Alexander sometimes tried to bridge the gap. He would buy Ethan expensive gifts, an elaborate Lego set, a miniature electric car, the latest gadgets. For a few moments, Ethan's eyes would light up. But the glow faded quickly, because gifts couldn't replace time. When Alexander left to take a call in the middle of playing, Ethan would quietly push the toy aside, the joy slipping away as quickly as it had come. For the household staff, it was obvious. The billionaire was successful in everything except being a father. Yet no one dared say a word. They respected him, feared him, and knew their jobs depended on silence. Only Maria, in her quiet way, stepped into the gap that Alexander had left. In the evenings, after finishing her duties, she would linger a little longer by Ethan's side. She would ask him about his drawings, and he would shyly explain his scribbles of houses, trees, and sometimes a family with 3 stick figures, one taller, one smaller, and one missing. Maria understood what he meant without him saying a word. The world saw Alexander Gray as untouchable, a man who had it all. But within the walls of his mansion, he was a man out of touch with his own son, with his own heart, and with the very meaning of wealth. This was the fragile foundation on which their story stood. A billionaire who believed money could replace presence, a little boy who longed for love, and a maid whose compassion would soon shake the very core of Alexander's pride. What Alexander didn't yet know was that the moment he truly saw Maria, not as a maid, but as the woman who had stepped into a role he had neglected, his world would change forever. And so, in the grand halls of the Gray Mansion, where silence had reigned for far too long, a quiet storm was already brewing. The days in the Gray Mansion followed a rhythm that, to outsiders, seemed enviable but to young Ethan felt unbearably hollow. The sun would rise over the sprawling gardens, casting golden light into his enormous bedroom filled with toys, books, and expensive gadgets. Yet, despite the abundance, Ethan often woke up feeling heavy with loneliness. His father was usually already gone, off to early meetings, and the maids followed routines that were efficient but impersonal. Ethan's mornings were dictated by schedules. Breakfast at 8, lessons at 9, piano practice at 11. Tutors came and went, hired by Alexander to shape his son into a prodigy. But Ethan, at only 8 years old, didn't crave academic achievements or finely tuned piano skills. What he longed for was simpler: a warm hug in the morning, someone to listen to his dreams, a voice to say, "I'm proud of you." When Clara had been alive, mornings had been different. Though Ethan's memories of his mother were faint, blurred by his young age, he could still recall her singing to him as sunlight spilled through the windows. She would brush his hair gently, ask him about the pictures he drew, and encourage his imagination. Without her, the mansion felt sterile, like a hotel where everyone was a guest and no one truly belonged. Ethan often retreated into his own world to cope. He drew pictures of families, stick figures holding hands, smiling under a bright sun. Sometimes he drew his mother, though he couldn't quite remember her face. Other times, he drew himself standing alone in a huge house, dwarfed by its towering walls. His teachers praised his talent for drawing, but they didn't understand the quiet message hidden in the sketches. A child's cry for belonging. Despite being surrounded by staff, Ethan felt invisible. The nannies were kind, but distant, treating him as a task to manage rather than a soul to nurture. They ensured he ate, that his clothes were clean, that he completed his lessons, but their care stopped at obligation. When Ethan spoke about his feelings, they smiled politely and redirected him back to his homework. It was Maria who first noticed the depth of Ethan's isolation. She had seen it in the way his eyes lingered on the front door every evening, waiting for his father to return. She had heard it in the silence of his room, where laughter should have been. And she had felt it in the small moments, like when he clutched her hand longer than necessary after she helped him down the stairs. Maria's own childhood had not been easy. She grew up in poverty, raised by a single mother who worked tirelessly as a cleaner to provide for her. Maria remembered the ache of longing when her mother worked late nights and the comfort she found in small gestures of love. A kiss on the forehead, a story whispered before bed, even when her mother was exhausted. Because of her past, She could recognize the same loneliness in Ethan. It wasn't just sadness. It was the hunger of a heart starved of connection. Ethan's loneliness became even more visible in the grand family dining room. The long table, designed to seat 20, often had only one small boy at its head, with staff standing by the walls, waiting for him to finish. Meals became mechanical, food placed, eaten quietly, and cleared away. Ethan sometimes tried to start conversations, but his timid voice faded quickly in the vast, echoing space. "Do you think Daddy will come home early today?" he once asked a maid. The woman smiled awkwardly, not knowing how to respond, and changed the subject to his homework. When Alexander did make rare appearances at meals, he often brought his phone with him, glancing at emails and answering calls even as his son tried to speak. Ethan would push peas around his plate, his questions dying on his lips. "How was your day, Daddy?" might be met with a distracted, "Busy, son," before Alexander excused himself to take another call. For Ethan, this pattern reinforced a painful belief that he was not important enough to command his father's full attention. His loneliness also showed at school. Teachers noticed his quiet demeanor, his reluctance to join group activities, and his tendency to sit alone during breaks. Children his age sometimes teased him, calling him the rich kid who had everything. But Ethan knew he had everything except the one thing they took for granted. Parents who cheered from the sidelines at soccer matches, who packed lunches with little notes, who asked about their day with genuine interest. Maria began stepping in where she could, gently and without making it obvious. When Ethan returned from school, she would ask him what he learned, and unlike the nannies, she truly listened. She praised his drawings, not just for their colors but for the feelings they expressed. Sometimes she sat with him in the garden, watching as he built little towers with his blocks. "That looks wonderful, Ethan," she'd say softly, and his eyes would brighten at the recognition. One rainy afternoon, Ethan sat by the window, staring at raindrops racing each other down the glass. Maria passed by and paused. "Why so sad, little one?" she asked. Ethan shrugged, his shoulders small and heavy. After a moment, he whispered, "Daddy doesn't like me." The words pierced Maria's heart. She knelt beside him and gently turned his face toward hers. "Oh, Ethan, your father loves you very much," she assured him, though she could see why he doubted it. "He just doesn't always know how to show it." Ethan looked down at his hands, silent. Maria placed a comforting hand over his. "But you're not alone, sweetheart. You're never alone when I'm here." Those simple words were like a lifeline for Ethan. His loneliness didn't vanish overnight, but in Maria's presence, he felt less invisible. She became the one who listened, the one who noticed when he was hurting, the one who saw him not as the billionaire's son, but as a child with a tender heart. Yet, Alexander remained oblivious. In his mind, everything was under control. He measured fatherhood in financial terms: trust funds, private tutors, the best doctors. He told himself Ethan would thank him one day, not realizing that the boy was quietly building emotional scars from neglect. Ethan's loneliness grew into a silent wall between father and son. He no longer tried to share stories about school or ask for attention at dinner. Instead, he retreated further into his drawings, his books, and the secret comfort he found in Maria's kindness. In the enormous mansion filled with light, Ethan lived in shadows, until the day Maria's quiet compassion began to change not only his world, but eventually Alexander's as well. Because loneliness, no matter how deeply buried, has a way of breaking through. And for Ethan, the cracks were already beginning to show. The change came suddenly, like a storm breaking across what had been an ordinary afternoon. Ethan returned from school one day looking pale, his usual quietness replaced by a lethargy that unsettled Maria the moment she saw him. His small shoulders slumped under the weight of his backpack, and his steps were slow, unsteady. "Ethan, sweetheart, are you all right?" Maria asked, kneeling to meet his eyes. The boy gave a weak nod, though his skin felt warm to the touch. His lips were dry, and his eyes heavy, as though sleep tugged at him with every blink. Alarm rose in Maria's chest. She called out to one of the other maids to fetch water and hurried Ethan upstairs. The boy gave a weak nod, though his skin felt warm to the touch. His lips were dry, and his eyes heavy, as though sleep tugged at him with every blink. Alarm rose in Maria's chest. She called out to one of the other maids to fetch water and hurried Ethan upstairs. By the time she tucked him into bed, his forehead was burning with fever. Maria didn't waste time. She sent for the doctor, who arrived within the hour, prescribed medication, and assured them it was nothing serious, just a flu. But as night fell, Ethan's condition worsened. He whimpered in his sleep, tossing restlessly, whispering for his mother in fevered dreams. Maria sat by his bedside, her heart breaking with every cry. This wasn't her child. Yet in that moment, every instinct in her body told her she couldn't leave him. She dismissed the staff who offered to take turns. "I'll stay," she said firmly. "He needs someone he trusts close by." The house grew quiet as midnight approached, the echoes of wealth retreating into silence. In Ethan's room, Maria dampened cloths with cool water, placing them gently on his forehead. She whispered soothing words, though she wasn't sure he heard. When he coughed and clutched at his chest, she held him against her, rubbing his back until he calmed. Hours passed. Ethan stirred again, his eyes fluttering open, glassy with fever. "I don't feel good," he murmured weakly. "I know, sweetheart," Maria said softly, brushing damp curls from his forehead. "But I'm right here. You're not alone." Ethan, vulnerable and longing, leaned into her. Without hesitation, Maria lifted him into her arms. She rocked him gently, humming an old lullaby her mother used to sing to her in her own childhood. Words from a different land, carrying the comfort of generations. Ethan's breathing steadied, his small body melting into her embrace, as though he had finally found the safety he had been searching for. As the hours dragged into early dawn, Maria barely moved. She sat in the rocking chair, Ethan asleep against her chest, her cheek resting on his hair. She thought about her own life, how she had once dreamed of children, of a family filled with laughter, but life's struggles had placed her in this mansion instead, raising another woman's son. She wondered if fate had brought her here to be the mother figure Ethan desperately needed. It was in this intimate scene that Alexander returned home. The billionaire pushed through the heavy doors of the mansion, weary from a long day of meetings. His tie was loosened, his brow furrowed with the weight of negotiations. He walked through the silent halls, noticing the unusual stillness. Normally, he would have gone straight to his study or bedroom, but something tugged at him. A faint sound of humming, so soft it was almost unnoticeable. Curious, he followed it upstairs. When he reached Ethan's room, he froze in the doorway. There, illuminated by the dim glow of a bedside lamp, sat Maria in the rocking chair. Ethan curled against her chest like a baby bird tucked safely in its nest. She hummed quietly, her hand stroking his hair with tenderness. Ethan, though feverish, looked peaceful for the first time that night. Alexander's heart jolted. He had never seen his son held with such raw, unconditional love since Clara's death. For a fleeting second, something inside him softened, an ache he had buried for years stirring awake. But just as quickly, his pride, his ego, and his ingrained sense of boundaries rose up. "What is going on here?" His voice was sharp, slicing through the tranquility. Maria startled, glancing up at him with wide eyes. She didn't move, unwilling to disturb the sleeping child in her arms. "Sir," she whispered, "Ethan has a fever. I stayed with him through the night. He needed comfort." Alexander stepped inside, his eyes narrowing. To him, the sight was complicated. On one hand, gratitude pricked at him. His son was safe, cared for. On the other hand, suspicion clouded his mind. He saw a maid, an employee, holding his son in a way that seemed far too intimate, far too close to a role that wasn't hers. "You're his maid," Alexander snapped, his voice low but firm. "Not his mother. This is not your place." The words stung Maria deeply. She lowered her gaze, tears brimming but unshed. She wanted to argue, to tell him that Ethan needed love, that she was only filling the void his absence had created. But she knew better than to confront a man like Alexander in that moment. She simply held Ethan closer, as if shielding him from the coldness of his father's voice. As if to underscore her point, Ethan stirred in his sleep and murmured softly, "Maria." His small arms tightened around her neck, his trust and attachment clear even in unconsciousness. Alexander saw it, and it unsettled him more than he cared to admit. He should have been the one his son called for. He should have been the one Ethan clung to. But here was his child, sick and vulnerable, finding solace in another's embrace. For a long moment, the room was heavy with unspoken truth. Alexander's pride told him this was an overstep, that he needed to reassert boundaries. Yet another, quieter voice inside whispered that perhaps it wasn't Maria who had overstepped, but himself who had fallen short. But Alexander, a man who had built his empire on control, wasn't ready to face that truth. Not yet. "Put him down," he said quietly, his tone brooking no argument. Maria obeyed, her movements careful not to wake Ethan as she laid him gently on the bed. She adjusted the covers, kissed his forehead softly, a gesture so natural it nearly broke Alexander's facade, and then stepped back, her eyes lowered. Alexander stood there, silent, watching his son sleep. Ethan looked fragile, yet peaceful, his small hand still reaching toward where Maria had been. Alexander felt a pang of guilt, though he buried it quickly beneath layers of pride. "Go," he said curtly. "I'll handle it from here." Maria left quietly, but the image of Ethan's fragile body clinging to her lingered in Alexander's mind long after she had gone. He sat by his son's bedside, but when Ethan stirred again, he did not reach for him. He whispered, "Maria." Even in dreams. For the first time in years, Alexander felt powerless. And though he refused to admit it, what he had seen unsettled the carefully constructed world he lived in. Because sometimes, the truth stares a man directly in the face. Not in boardrooms, not in bank accounts, but in the fragile hands of a child reaching for love. The next morning, the gray mansion seemed unusually tense. The storm from the night before, both literal and emotional, still lingered in the air. Ethan, though still weak, was up and resting in his bed, his fever beginning to break thanks to Maria's constant care. The other maids tiptoed around the halls, whispering in hushed tones. They had seen Alexander's expression the previous night, a mixture of shock, disapproval, and something else they couldn't name. Everyone in the mansion knew that when Alexander Gray was unsettled, nothing good followed. Maria woke with swollen eyes from lack of sleep and worry. She had spent much of the night replaying Alexander's words in her mind. "You're his maid, not his mother. This is not your place." The sting of those words clung to her like a shadow. She had not meant to overstep boundaries, at least not intentionally. She had only followed her heart when she saw Ethan in pain. Was it wrong to show compassion? Was it wrong to give the boy what he clearly lacked? She tried to push the thoughts aside and went about her morning tasks, folding linens and preparing breakfast trays. But her hands trembled, and her mind wandered to the possibility that Alexander might dismiss her. Jobs like this didn't come easily, and Maria supported not just herself but also her aging mother back home. Losing this job would mean far more than heartbreak. It would mean financial hardship. Still, when she glanced toward Ethan's room and saw him sitting up, coloring quietly with pale cheeks, she felt a sense of peace. Whatever happened, she had done right by him. Alexander, however, was a man of routine and order, and last night had disrupted both. He emerged from his study mid-morning, dressed impeccably as always, his face unreadable. When he called for Maria, his voice carried a sharpness that made the staff exchange nervous glances. "Maria," he said firmly, his tone leaving no room for hesitation. "My study. Now." Her heart sank, but she obeyed. Inside the study, the air felt heavier than usual. The room was lined with bookshelves, the scent of leather and polish thick. Alexander stood by the window, his hands behind his back, his silhouette imposing against the morning light. For a long moment, he didn't turn to face her, letting the silence stretch. Maria clasped her hands nervously in front of her apron, waiting. Finally, he spoke. "Last night," he began, his voice low, "I came home to find my son in your arms." Maria's breath caught, but she said nothing, unsure of whether to defend herself or wait for his accusations. "That," Alexander continued, finally turning to face her, "is not part of your responsibilities. You are here to maintain order, to see to the household needs. Not to—" he faltered slightly, searching for the word. "Not to assume roles that are not yours." Maria's throat tightened. She wanted to tell him that Ethan had been burning with fever, that he had cried out for someone, anyone, and that she had simply responded. But the sharpness in Alexander's eyes made her hesitate. "Sir," she said softly, "with respect, Ethan was sick. He needed comfort. I only stayed because he asked for me." Alexander's jaw clenched. "He should be asking for me," he shot back, his voice rising slightly. "I am his father, not you." The words rang through the room like a whip crack. Maria lowered her gaze, her lips trembling, but she couldn't stay silent. "And where were you, sir?" she asked quietly, almost a whisper. "Where were you when he cried for you?" The question cut through Alexander's pride like a blade. He stiffened, his eyes flashing. No one spoke to him that way. Not business rivals, not his employees, not even politicians he funded. But this woman, this maid, had dared to hold up a mirror to his failure. "You forget your place?" Alexander said coldly, his voice like steel. "You are an employee in this house. Nothing more. Do not mistake kindness for entitlement." Maria's eyes filled with tears, but she kept her composure. "I did not forget my place, sir," she said, her voice steadier now. "I remembered his. He is a child. A lonely, hurting child who needed someone. If that was wrong, then I will accept whatever consequences you decide." For a moment, silence hung between them, thick with unspoken truths. Alexander's chest rose and fell with restrained anger, or perhaps something deeper he couldn't admit. He wanted to tell her she had overstepped, that Ethan needed discipline, not coddling. But the memory of his son whispering Maria's name in his sleep gnawed at him. The boy had chosen her, not him, and that truth was unbearable. The confrontation was interrupted by a small knock on the door. Both turned to see Ethan standing there, clutching his sketchbook. His face was pale, his hair messy, but his eyes, those wide, innocent eyes, were fixed on Maria. "Maria," he said softly, almost pleading. Maria instinctively moved toward him, but Alexander stepped forward quickly, placing a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "Go back to bed, son. You need rest," he said, forcing a smile. But Ethan shook his head and clung to Maria's hand. "I want Maria," he whispered, his voice fragile but firm. The words hung in the air like a dagger. Alexander's hand fell away. His son hadn't asked for him. He hadn't even looked at him. He had gone straight to the maid. For Alexander, the humiliation was sharp. To be rejected by his own son in favor of someone else, a servant no less, was an affront to his pride. He clenched his fists, his expression darkening. Maria, sensing the storm in his silence, bent down to Ethan and whispered gently, "Go rest, sweetheart. I'll be there soon." She kissed his forehead lightly, and with some coaxing, one of the maids led Ethan back to his room. When the door closed, Alexander turned on Maria with a look that could have frozen stone. "Do you see what you've done?" he hissed. "You've made him dependent on you. You've created confusion. This is unacceptable." Maria swallowed hard, her hands trembling. "I didn't create his need for love, sir. I only answered it." The defiance in her words, quiet as it was, struck Alexander deeply. His pride told him she was wrong. His heart whispered she was right. But pride won the battle that day. "Enough," Alexander said sharply, his voice final. "This ends now. You will keep your distance from my son. Do your duties, nothing more. If you cannot follow that, you will no longer have a place in this house." Maria's chest ached, but she nodded, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. She turned and left the study, her dignity intact though her heart felt shattered. Behind her, Alexander sank into his chair, staring at the empty doorway. He had won the confrontation, or so he told himself. But deep inside, a hollow victory rang bitter, because he knew that in pushing Maria away, he wasn't protecting his son. He was protecting his pride. And for Ethan, the price of that pride would soon become unbearable. The following days in the gray mansion carried a suffocating heaviness. What had once been an unspoken rhythm of duties and routines now became a minefield of silence. The staff avoided Maria, not out of disdain but out of fear that proximity to her might draw Alexander's ire. Whispers floated through the halls, servants gossiping about whether Maria's dismissal was imminent. Maria herself moved like a shadow. She still woke before dawn, polished the silver, ironed linens, and carried out every duty with precision. But her spirit was no longer present in her tasks. She avoided Ethan's gaze whenever he looked for her, though each time she turned away, her heart cracked a little more. Alexander's words replayed endlessly in her mind. "You will keep your distance from my son. Do your duties, nothing more." Yet Ethan did not understand boundaries or commands whispered behind closed doors. He only knew that the woman who once sat by his bed, read him stories, and held him close now avoided him with painful deliberation. He noticed her absence when nightmares woke him. He noticed when his lunch tray arrived without the quiet smile she always gave. He noticed, most painfully, when he asked for her and another maid came instead. "Why won't Maria come?" Ethan asked one evening, his small voice breaking as he pushed away his dinner. The maid tried to soothe him, but he shoved the tray aside and buried his face in his arms. Alone in the corridor, Maria listened to his cries, her hands clutching the tray she carried for another room. Tears streamed down her cheeks, but she couldn't go in. Alexander's warning had been clear. To disobey would mean losing everything. Still, her heart battled with her fear. Each night, she lay awake in her small quarters, staring at the ceiling, praying for guidance. She thought of her mother back home, whose medicines and meals depended on the wages Maria sent faithfully each month. If she were dismissed, both she and her mother would suffer. Could she risk that? And yet, each time she remembered Ethan's little arms clinging to her, his fragile voice whispering her name, she felt the crushing weight of another truth. Perhaps losing her place in the mansion was less painful than watching a child she loved be starved of affection. One evening, as she finished polishing the silver in the quiet of the dining room, she heard footsteps behind her. She turned to see Ethan, barefoot in his pajamas, clutching his blanket. His eyes were red from crying. "Maria," he whispered, his voice breaking. Her resolve crumbled. She knelt before him, gathering him into her arms despite the risk. He buried his face against her shoulder, his little body trembling. "Why don't you stay with me anymore?" he asked between sobs. "Did I do something wrong?" Maria's heart shattered into 1,000 pieces. "Oh, Ethan, no," she murmured, smoothing his hair. "You did nothing wrong. You are perfect. It's me." Her voice broke, but she forced herself to go on. "It's me who is not allowed." "Not allowed?" he asked, confused. Maria bit her lip, unable to explain the complexities of adult pride and power. Instead, she whispered, "Sometimes grown-ups make rules that are hard to understand. But listen to me, you are loved, Ethan. Don't ever doubt that." He looked up at her, tears glistening in his eyes. "But not by Papa," he said softly. The words struck her like lightning. It wasn't rebellion or disrespect. It was truth. Alexander had been absent, cold, distant, and Ethan, though young, had already recognized it. That night, Maria made her decision. She could no longer watch this child suffer in silence. She couldn't keep turning her back to him, pretending not to hear his cries. If Alexander truly wanted her gone, then so be it. But she would not abandon Ethan, not when he needed her the most. The next morning, Maria penned a letter of resignation. Her hands shook as she wrote, each stroke of ink weighted with sorrow. She explained, respectfully but firmly, that though she was grateful for the opportunity to work in the Gray household, She could not continue in an environment where her compassion for a child was seen as a transgression. She folded the letter neatly and tucked it into her apron, intending to deliver it after breakfast. But fate had its own way of unfolding. At breakfast, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Alexander sat at the head of the table, scanning his emails on his tablet while sipping coffee. Ethan sat beside him, listlessly poking at his eggs. The boy's usual chatter was gone, replaced by silence. Maria entered with the tray of fresh juice, her heart pounding. She placed the glasses carefully on the table, her hands trembling slightly. As she turned to leave, she felt a small tug on her apron. "Maria," Ethan whispered. Alexander's head snapped up, his sharp gaze narrowing. Maria froze. "Go back to your seat, Ethan," Alexander said sternly. But Ethan shook his head. "I want Maria," he said louder this time, his little voice echoing through the dining hall. "I want her to stay with me. Always." The words pierced the room, shattering the fragile silence. The staff who lingered nearby gasped quietly. Maria's breath caught, her letter of resignation suddenly heavy against her chest. Alexander's jaw tightened, his eyes flicking from his son to Maria. Rage simmered beneath the surface, but so did something else. Hurt. "Ethan," he said, his voice trembling despite his attempt at control. "You have me. I am your father. You don't need." "I do need her," Ethan cried, tears welling in his eyes. "You don't hold me when I'm sick. You don't read me stories. You don't even listen. But Maria does. She loves me. Why can't you?" The boy's raw words cut deeper than any boardroom insult Alexander had ever endured. For the first time in years, he found himself speechless. His son's pain, laid bare in front of him and the household staff, tore through his pride like a blade. Maria, trembling, knelt beside Ethan and hugged him tightly. She wanted to protect him from the storm she knew was coming, but she also knew she couldn't shield him forever. "Ethan," she whispered, her tears falling into his hair. "You are brave for speaking your heart. Never be ashamed of that." Alexander rose slowly from his chair, his face unreadable. The room seemed to hold its breath. "Maria," he said, his voice low but steady. "My office. Now." She swallowed hard, kissed Ethan's forehead, and rose to her feet. With shaking hands, she reached into her apron and pulled out the folded resignation letter. She placed it on the table in front of Alexander without a word and walked toward the door. Ethan's cries followed her down the hall, echoing in her ears. Each sob was a knife, but Maria steeled herself. She had made her decision. She would not allow Ethan to grow up believing that love was conditional or that compassion was wrong. Even if it cost her everything, she would leave with her integrity intact. What she didn't know was that Alexander, staring down at the letter she had left, was battling his own decision, one that could change everything. Alexander sat alone in his office, the resignation letter still unopened on his desk. The heavy mahogany furniture, polished to perfection, gleamed in the soft morning light streaming through the tall windows. Yet despite the grandeur of his surroundings, Alexander felt smaller than he ever had in his life. The mansion, usually a place of order and control, seemed to echo with Ethan's cries even though the boy had been carried away by the nanny hours ago. The sound haunted Alexander, looping in his mind. His son's words were sharp, unpolished, but true. "You don't hold me when I'm sick. You don't read me stories. You don't even listen." Alexander buried his face in his hands, pressing his palms against his temples as though he could force the memories out. But they persisted, unrelenting. He saw Ethan's tear-stained cheeks, heard the raw pain in his voice, and felt the deep fissure of failure in his chest. For years, Alexander Gray had prided himself on control. Control over his company, control over his employees, control over his public image. Yet here, in the one arena where control mattered least but love mattered most, he had failed utterly. And Maria had been the one to reveal that failure. Not through defiance, not through anger, but through simple, consistent love for Ethan. She had filled the gaps Alexander had ignored, and now she was leaving because of it. The letter sat there, silent, damning. Alexander reached for it with hesitant hands, unfolding the paper slowly as though its words might detonate. Asterisk, Mr. Gray, it is with respect and gratitude that I offer my resignation from your household. I cannot, in good conscience, continue in a place where the affection I give a child is seen as transgression rather than care. Ethan is a remarkable boy, and it has been an honor to love him as if he were my own. I leave because it seems what he needs most is not something I am permitted to give. Thank you for the opportunity. Sincerely, Maria Daniels. Asterisk. The neat handwriting blurred as Alexander's vision clouded. He placed the letter down, staring at it for what felt like hours. Every word carved deeper into him. Maria wasn't bitter. She wasn't resentful. She was simply honest. And that honesty was more brutal than any accusation. For the first time in years, Alexander questioned not just his actions, but his very identity. Who was he, really? A billionaire with endless resources, yes. A leader respected or feared in boardrooms across the world, certainly. But a father? He barely qualified for the title. He rose abruptly, pacing the length of his office. His mind reached back to the day Ethan was born. He remembered the tiny bundle placed in his arms, the overwhelming surge of fear he had mistaken for indifference. His wife's illness had kept her weak, and Alexander had buried himself in work to cope. When she passed, he buried himself even deeper, convincing himself that money and security would fill the void for Ethan. But money had never tucked a child into bed. Security had never wiped away tears. Success in business had never once whispered "I love you" into the ears of a frightened boy. The truth hit him with the force of a storm. He had abandoned his son emotionally long before Maria entered their lives. A knock at the door interrupted his spiraling thoughts. It was his sister, Catherine, who sometimes visited the mansion to check on Ethan. She stepped in cautiously, her eyes landing on the letter. "You've read it?" she asked softly. Alexander's jaw tightened. "Yes." Catherine walked further inside, her heels clicking against the floor. "You're making a mistake if you let her go." He frowned. "You don't understand." She crossed a line. She loved him," Catherine interrupted sharply. "Something you haven't figured out how to do." Her words, though blunt, were not cruel. They were weary, born of watching her nephew's loneliness grow year after year. Alexander looked away, ashamed. Catherine's voice softened. "Alex, Ethan is breaking. And so are you, whether you admit it or not. That boy needs stability, yes, but he needs tenderness more. Maria gave him both. If you send her away, you're not protecting him. You're stripping him of the only anchor he has left." Alexander sank back into his chair, running a hand over his face. "And what if I can't? What if I don't know how to be what he needs?" "Then learn," Catherine said firmly. "You've built empires, Alex. Surely you can learn how to hold your own child." The words lingered long after she left. Alexander sat in silence, the resignation letter still open before him, feeling the weight of two choices pressing down. Pride or humility, control or surrender, failure or redemption. That night, Alexander did something he had not done in years. He walked quietly to Ethan's room. The boy was asleep, his little chest rising and falling in the dim glow of the night light. His blanket was clutched tightly, but his face was still streaked with the dried remnants of tears. Alexander stood there, frozen, as though approaching his son required more courage than facing a hostile takeover. Slowly, almost mechanically, he reached out and brushed a strand of hair from Ethan's forehead. The boy stirred slightly but did not wake. In that fragile moment, Alexander whispered words that surprised even himself. "I'm sorry, Ethan. I failed you, but I don't want to fail anymore." Maria's breath caught. She searched his eyes, looking for sincerity. For once, she found it. "I'll stay," she whispered. "But only if Ethan's needs come first. Always." Alexander nodded firmly. Always. In that moment, the walls of pride Alexander had built around himself began to crumble. It was not the end of his journey, but it was the turning point, the first step toward redemption. The first morning after Maria agreed to stay felt different in the gray mansion. For years, Alexander had woken with the rhythm of routine. The chime of his alarm, the rush of emails, the efficient glide from his bedroom to his office. He'd never lingered in the hallway outside Ethan's room, never paused to listen for the sound of his son stirring. But this morning he did. He stood outside Ethan's door, uncertain, his hand hovering near the doorknob. From inside, he could hear the soft murmur of Maria's voice, soothing and patient. She was helping Ethan get dressed for school, turning a mundane ritual into something warm. Alexander hesitated. He wasn't sure if his presence would be welcome, but he had made a promise to himself and to Ethan that he would not fail again. So, gathering courage, he pushed the door open. Ethan sat on the edge of his bed, his shirt halfway buttoned, Maria kneeling in front of him to tie his shoelaces. The boy looked up, his expression wary when he saw his father. Alexander cleared his throat softly. "Good morning, Ethan." The words felt strange, heavy, like an unfamiliar language. Ethan blinked at him, saying nothing at first. Then, after a pause, he muttered, "Morning." Maria glanced between them, sensing the fragile tension in the air. She gave Alexander the faintest nod, encouraging him to step closer. "I thought," Alexander continued, forcing calm into his voice, "that I could take you to school today, if you'd like." Ethan frowned, suspicion flickering across his small face. "You? You're always busy." Alexander winced at the truth in the words. "I was, but I want to change that. Just for today, no meetings, no work. Just you and me." The boy studied him, searching for cracks in the promise. Maria placed a gentle hand on Ethan's shoulder. "Maybe give him a chance, Ethan. Everyone deserves one." After a long silence, Ethan nodded reluctantly. "Okay." It was a small victory, but Alexander felt as though he had scaled a mountain. The drive to school was quiet at first. Alexander gripped the steering wheel too tightly, his mind racing with doubts. He had closed billion-dollar deals with confidence. Yet here, sitting next to his 7-year-old son, he was terrified of saying the wrong thing. Ethan sat slumped in the passenger seat, clutching his backpack. His gaze flicked occasionally toward his father, then out the window again. Finally, Alexander broke the silence. "You know, when I was your age, I hated school mornings. I used to drag my feet so much my mother had to bribe me with pancakes just to get me out the door." Ethan turned his head, eyes widening. "Really?" Alexander chuckled softly. "Really. I once hid in the garden so I wouldn't have to go. Thought I was very clever, until my father found me covered in mud." For the first time in what felt like forever, Ethan laughed. It wasn't loud, just a quick burst of sound, but it filled the car like sunlight breaking through clouds. Encouraged, Alexander smiled. "Maybe one day I'll make you pancakes, though I can't promise they'll taste any good." "Maria makes the best pancakes," Ethan said quickly, defending her title as though it were sacred. "I don't doubt that," Alexander replied warmly. "Maybe she could teach me." Ethan tilted his head, skeptical but intrigued. "You'd actually try?" "Yes," Alexander said firmly. "For you, I try." Over the next few weeks, Alexander kept his promise. He rearranged his schedule, canceling dinners and delegating tasks he once hoarded. Each morning, he either joined Ethan for breakfast or drove him to school. Each evening, he tried, awkwardly, clumsily, to be present. At first, Ethan remained guarded. He expected his father's attention to vanish as quickly as it appeared. But Alexander persisted. When Ethan wanted to show him a drawing, Alexander put his phone down and listened. When Ethan struggled with homework, Alexander sat beside him, fumbling through math problems he hadn't touched in decades. Maria became both a guide and a silent witness to their progress. She taught Alexander how to read Ethan's moods, how to comfort him when nightmares woke him at night, how to praise him without making it sound like a business appraisal. One evening, Maria found Alexander sitting cross-legged on the floor of Ethan's room, a picture book open in his lap. Ethan was curled against his father's side, fighting sleep as Alexander read aloud in a low, hesitant voice. And the little prince said, "What makes the desert beautiful is that somewhere it hides a well." Maria stood in the doorway unseen. A smile tugged at her lips. This was what Ethan had needed all along. Not wealth, not toys, not endless rooms filled with silence. But this, the steady rhythm of a father's voice, the warmth of arms that finally felt like home. Of course, the healing was not seamless. There were setbacks. One afternoon, when Alexander had to take an urgent call, Ethan's face crumpled in disappointment. "I knew it," the boy muttered, storming off before his father could explain. Alexander wanted to chase him, to insist it was only one call. But Maria stopped him gently. "Consistency builds trust, Mr. Gray. You've made progress, but Ethan's wounds are deep. He needs time to believe this isn't temporary." Her words stung, but Alexander knew they were true. So instead of defending himself, he waited until the call was over, then sought Ethan out in his room. He knocked softly, sitting on the floor rather than towering over him. "I broke my promise today," Alexander admitted. "And I'm sorry. I want to do better." Ethan stared at him, arms folded. But something in his father's sincerity chipped away at his anger. After a long pause, he whispered, "Just don't stop trying." "I won't," Alexander vowed. Weeks turned into months, and the mansion began to change. Where once its halls had echoed with emptiness, now they carried laughter, the sound of footsteps running, the occasional crash of a ball against an expensive vase. Maria sometimes scolded, but Alexander surprised everyone by laughing at the chaos he once despised. He was learning slowly, painfully, that love was messy. It was inconvenient, unpredictable, vulnerable. But it was worth everything. One Saturday morning, Alexander woke early to find Maria in the kitchen, flipping pancakes as Ethan sat at the counter, humming to himself. "Good morning," Alexander said, rolling up his sleeves. "Move over, Chef Maria. Today, I'm on pancake duty." Maria raised a skeptical brow. "Are you sure about that?" Ethan giggled. "He's gonna burn them." "Probably," Alexander admitted, grinning as he grabbed a bowl. "But maybe you'll eat one out of pity." The kitchen filled with laughter as flour dusted the counters. Batter splattered the stovetop, and the first batch came out half-charred. Yet Ethan devoured them proudly, declaring, "Best pancakes ever, because Dad made them." In that messy, joy-filled moment, Alexander realized the truth. Wealth had built his house, but love was building his home. The bond between father and son was not yet unbreakable, but it was growing stronger with each shared meal, each bedtime story, each whispered apology and hesitant smile. Maria, ever watchful, felt her heart swell. This was the healing she had prayed for, not just for Ethan but for Alexander too. The mansion no longer felt like a monument to loneliness. It was becoming, slowly but surely, a sanctuary of love. The winter frost had begun to thaw, and with it, so too had the ice that had long encased the gray mansion. Where silence once reigned, now laughter echoed through its halls. Where shadows lingered, light began to stream in. The transformation wasn't sudden. It had taken months of small, deliberate steps. But to Alexander it felt like a miracle. It was a crisp Saturday morning when Alexander woke earlier than usual, the soft sound of Ethan's laughter drifting up from the kitchen. He smiled to himself. That laugh, once so rare, was now a regular part of his days. It had become his favorite sound, more valuable than any symphony or business triumph. He rose, dressed simply in a sweater and jeans, and descended the grand staircase. He paused halfway, unseen, as he caught sight of a scene that made his chest tighten. Maria was in the kitchen, hair wrapped in a simple scarf, apron tied loosely around her waist. Ethan was perched on a stool beside her, legs swinging as he stirred a bowl of pancake batter. His cheeks were dusted with flour, his eyes bright as he chattered about a school project. Maria listened with genuine warmth, nodding, laughing softly, occasionally brushing flour from his nose. It was the picture of family, and for the first time in years, Alexander felt like he belonged inside it. Later that morning, Alexander drove Ethan to his soccer game. Months ago, He wouldn't have even known such events were on the calendar. But now he carried Ethan's gear himself, walking proudly by his side. On the field, Ethan played with energy and joy, glancing often toward the sidelines where his father and Maria stood together, cheering him on. Each time Ethan's eyes found Alexander's, the boy's face lit up with a grin so wide it seemed to banish years of quiet hurt. When Ethan scored his first goal, Alexander jumped up, clapping wildly, his voice hoarse from shouting, "That's my boy!" Maria laughed at his enthusiasm, but her eyes glistened with tears. She knew better than anyone how much Ethan had craved that moment. That evening, the three of them shared dinner at the long oak table that once had felt too vast and empty. Now it felt alive. Plates passed back and forth, stories shared, laughter bubbling freely. Halfway through the meal, Ethan spoke up, his small voice carrying surprising weight. "Dad," he said, looking at Alexander, "do you promise you won't leave again? Not like before?" The question pierced Alexander's heart. He set down his fork, leaning closer, his eyes fixed on his son's. "I promise," Alexander said firmly. "I can't change the mistakes I made, Ethan, but I can change what I do from now on. I'll always be here for you." Ethan studied him for a long moment, as though testing the words. Then, quietly, he slid from his chair and walked around the table. He climbed into his father's lap, resting his head against Alexander's chest. It was the first time Ethan had voluntarily sought his father's embrace. Alexander's arms wrapped around him instinctively, holding him close, his throat tightening with emotion. Maria, sitting across from them, wiped at her eyes, her heart swelling with joy. The months that followed brought more changes. Alexander began taking Ethan on small adventures, visits to the park, weekend trips to the zoo, even quiet afternoons spent painting in the garden. He learned to cherish time, not as something to be spent on deals and meetings, but as something to be shared with those he loved. His company board members noticed the shift. Alexander was still sharp, still commanding, but there was a softness in him now. He delegated more, smiled more, even brought Ethan to an office family day where the boy shyly introduced Maria as the one who saved us. One evening, Alexander found himself sitting with Maria in the garden while Ethan played nearby. The air was scented with jasmine, the sky awash with stars. "You've given me something I didn't know how to ask for," Alexander said quietly. Maria tilted her head. "And what's that?" "A second chance. With my son. With myself." His gaze softened. "I don't think I'll ever be able to repay you." Maria smiled gently. "Love doesn't ask for repayment. It just asks to be shared." Their eyes met, and in that silent exchange, something unspoken passed between them. Respect, gratitude, and perhaps something deeper. Something that hinted at a future neither had dared to imagine before. Spring blossomed, and with it came a celebration. It was Ethan's 8th birthday, and for the first time, Alexander insisted on hosting a grand party. Not one filled with stiff guests and business acquaintances, but with children from Ethan's school, balloons, games, and laughter. Maria worked tirelessly to prepare, decorating the garden with strings of lights and colorful ribbons. Alexander personally chose the cake, insisting on Ethan's favorite flavor, chocolate with strawberries. When the day arrived, the mansion pulsed with life. Children ran across the lawn, their laughter mixing with the music. Ethan, wearing a paper crown, beamed brighter than the sun. At one point, he tugged Maria's hand and pulled her toward Alexander. "Dad," Ethan said proudly, "Maria's not just our maid. She's family." Alexander's throat tightened. He glanced at Maria, who looked stunned, her eyes shimmering with tears. "You're right, Ethan," Alexander said softly, placing a hand on her shoulder. "She is family." The words hung in the air, heavy with truth. For the first time in years, Alexander felt whole. His son had healed. He himself had healed. And Maria, the woman who had entered their lives as a servant, now stood as the glue that held them together. As the evening wound down and the last of the guests departed, Alexander stood on the balcony overlooking the garden. Ethan was asleep inside, clutching his new toy car, while Maria tidied the remains of the celebration. Alexander watched her, his heart full. Slowly he approached. "You've changed everything," he said quietly. Maria looked up, surprised. "I only did what anyone with love in their heart would do." "No," Alexander said firmly. "You did what no one else could. You gave me back my son. You gave him back his childhood." There was a pause. Then, in a voice thick with emotion, he added, "And you gave me something I never thought I'd have again, hope." Maria's lips parted, but no words came. Instead, she simply smiled, a soft, radiant smile that said more than words ever could. The story of the gray mansion no longer ended in cold marble and echoing halls. It had become a story of redemption. A billionaire who once thought wealth was everything learned that love was worth more than gold. A boy who once felt abandoned found security in his father's arms. And a woman who once came only as a maid had become the cornerstone of a family reborn. As the night deepened and stars scattered across the sky, Alexander stood with Maria beside him, Ethan asleep within, and whispered a truth that had taken him a lifetime to learn. Home isn't what you build with money. It's what you build with love. And in that moment, the gray mansion finally became a home.